It happened on a Tuesday in January, in the kitchen of a house that wasn't mine, and the thing that caught me wasn't a look or a word. It was a coffee cup. She set it on the counter in front of me without asking how I took it. Black, no sugar, no cream, exactly right. And when I looked up, Rowena was already watching me, holding her own cup in both hands. And there was something in her expression I didn't know how to name. She didn't smile. She said very quietly, "You looked cold." Then she walked back into the living room, where Hugo was talking to his colleagues from the engineering firm, and I stood alone in the kitchen of my best friend's house, holding a cup of coffee she had made perfectly for me, not knowing what to do with any of it. My name is Maxwell Burrows. I'm 38 years old and I restore heritage homes in Ottawa, Ontario. I work mostly in the older neighborhoods, the Glebe, New Edinburgh, Sandy Hill. The kind of houses built between 1880 and 1920 from limestone and red brick and old-growth timber, renovated so many times that most people have forgotten what they originally looked like underneath. My job is to find out. I strip wallpaper and pull up flooring and peel away 40 years of contractor shortcuts and bad decisions, and I try to get back to what was honest about the place. It's slow work. People expect the before and after reveal, the kind you see on renovation programs, and I give them that eventually. But the part they don't see is the weeks in between, when the house is nothing but exposed plaster and bare subfloor and the smell of old damp, and you have to decide what's worth saving and what isn't. I'm good at making that call in a house. I've never been particularly good at making it anywhere else. I live alone in a semi-detached Victorian on Clemau Avenue in the Glebe, a house I bought with my ex-wife Genevieve and kept after we split. I divorced Genevieve 2 years before any of this happened. No children. 4 years of marriage that didn't end badly so much as it ended slowly, the way the Rideau Canal freezes over, so gradually you don't notice until one day the whole surface is solid and there's nothing moving underneath. Genevieve wanted Bay Street. She wanted a condo in Toronto's King West, a job at a firm where people talked about their investment portfolios at dinner. She wanted a version of me that wore dress shoes to work and had opinions about staging a house for resale. I signed the papers on a gray Wednesday in October and drove home to Ottawa, and that was that. The house on Clemau was mine. The winters were mine. The quiet was mine. Hugo Strand was my best friend from our first week at the University of Ottawa. We met in September of first year during engineering and architecture orientation, two people who didn't know anyone else at the welcome barbecue, and by October, we were splitting a transit pass and complaining about the same professors. By the time we graduated, he was the closest thing I had to a brother. He became a civil engineer, infrastructure, mostly, highway bridges and drainage systems across northern Ontario. He traveled constantly, sometimes gone 3 weeks out of every 4. Hugo married Rowena 3 years before January. I was his best man. I remember standing at the front of the church on Elgin Street, watching her walk down the aisle and feeling something I did not examine then, something I folded very carefully and put away in a place I told myself I would never open. Hugo was the person who showed up at my door the night I signed the divorce papers and didn't say a single useless thing. He just brought 2 pints and sat at the kitchen table with me until the worst of it passed. That's the kind of man he was. He just could never manage to be that present for Rowena. After Genevieve left, I found a rhythm, woke early, ran the canal path before the city came to life, worked the job sites through the day, ate alone in the evenings. Simple, not unhappy, or at least that's what I told myself every night in a house that had 2 chairs at the kitchen table, and only one of them ever moved. Rowena appeared at the edges of my life the way weather does in Ottawa, gradually and then all at once. Hugo traveled, and she stayed. She would show up with a reason, a question about the house. Could I look at the back door frame that was sticking? Did I have a pipe wrench she could borrow? After a while the reasons got thinner, and then they disappeared altogether, and she would just knock, and I would make coffee, and we would sit at the kitchen table and talk about nothing in particular. She grew up on Prince Edward Island, near Charlottetown. She worked part-time at a gallery on Sussex Drive and spent the rest of her time reading. She had opinions about things nobody else in my life had opinions about: old National Film Board documentaries, the specific weight of silence in different kinds of rooms, whether it was possible to feel homesick for a place you'd never actually lived in. I didn't notice the pattern at the time. Looking back now, I know exactly what was happening. She was finding reasons to be near me, and I was holding the door open without admitting, even to myself, why. The detail I keep coming back to is the coffee. Rowena always drank hers black. No sugar, no milk, never varied it, not once. Every time she came to the house or the job site, she would bring 2 cups from the cafe on Bank Street, set one in front of me without asking, and keep the other for herself. I never mentioned that she'd gotten it exactly right from the first time. She never mentioned it either. It was just there. Every visit, 2 cups, black, no explanation required. She came to a job site in New Edinburgh once, an 1890s townhouse I was in the middle of restoring. I was in the front room stripping the last of 6 layers of wallpaper from the original plaster, and she sat on an overturned 5-gallon pail with a book and her coffee while I worked. At some point she set the book down, walked over to the exposed plaster wall, and ran her fingertips across the surface slowly, the way you'd read something in Braille. She asked, "What's underneath all those layers?" I said, "The original plaster. And underneath that, the lath. And underneath that, the framing." She nodded, quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You strip everything back to find what was honest about the place." I said yes. She said, "Do you ever try that with yourself?" I laughed. That night I couldn't sleep. The signs kept coming and I kept deciding not to read them. She knew I ran the canal path on weekday mornings, though I'd never told her. She just knew, the way she seemed to know most things about me without my having mentioned them. She asked once about Genevieve, not with curiosity, just with the careful directness of someone who actually wants to understand. I told her the truth plainly, the way I tell most truths. Genevieve wanted someone different. I couldn't become that person. Rowena was quiet for a long time. Then she said softly, "The right person doesn't ask you to become someone you're not." I looked up. She was already watching me. I looked down first, the way I always did, every single time, without exception. Looking down first was the only thing standing between me and something I was not ready to face. Hugo was my best friend. I would never have crossed a line I couldn't walk back from. But there is a difference between not acting and not feeling, and I was standing exactly in the space between those two things, not knowing which way the floor was going to tilt. One February night, Ottawa February, the real kind, where the cold presses against every window like something with intent, a pipe in Rowena and Hugo's bathroom burst. Hugo was in Sudbury. She knocked on my door at 9:30 in the evening, holding her phone. She'd called a plumber, but nobody could come until morning. I told her I'd look at it. I spent 2 hours under their bathroom floor with a wrench and a headlamp, the kind of uncomfortable work that reminds you what your body is actually for. When I finished and the water was stopped and the mess dealt with, she walked me to the front door. She stood on the top step in the cold. It was -23. The street absolutely still under a foot of fresh snow, and said, "Max, can I come over for a bit? I don't want to be alone in an empty house tonight." I nodded. I didn't trust myself to say more than that. We sat in my kitchen with the light low and the city silent under the snow, 2 cups of coffee on the table between us. I measured the distance between those cups with my eyes at least 100 times after that night. 1 handspan, always close enough. I never reached. Over the months that followed, Rowena talked about her marriage the way you talk about a house you've lived in that never quite suited you. No bitterness, just facts in a steady voice. Hugo was a good man. She said that and meant it, and I believed her, but Hugo didn't see her. He saw a wife the way certain people see a function rather than a person. He didn't know she wrote long letters to her grandmother in Summerside that she never sent, that she cried at a specific kind of quiet ending in a film, that she needed someone to sit across from her in silence and not feel the need to fill it with something. She said to me one evening, very quietly, "Do you know what it feels like to eat dinner with someone every night and have them never once ask what you've been thinking about that day?" I knew. Genevieve had been exactly that way. I didn't say it. Some things are too heavy to share when you're still carrying them yourself. I told myself I needed distance. I started saying no, busy week, behind on the townhouse, sorry. But every time I said no, the rest of the day felt hollowed out, the way a room feels when you've pulled all the furniture against the walls, and Rowena never pushed. She just sent a short message. "How's the new Edinburgh house coming?" No rush, just wondering. I knew she wasn't asking about the house. I answered every time because not answering felt like holding my breath underwater. There was an afternoon at the Lansdowne Farmers Market in early May, the first warm Saturday of the year, when the whole south end of the city comes blinking out of a 6-month winter. I was at a table of local honey when Rowena appeared from the crowd. She walked past me without stopping, slipped a small jar of wild leek pesto into my canvas bag, the kind you can only get for 2 weeks in spring, from the foragers who come down from the Gatineau Hills, and said without looking back, "For when you make pasta, you'll know when." She kept walking and didn't look back. I stood there holding the jar and realized I was smiling, a real one, the kind that starts before you give it permission. It was the first real smile I'd had at a market in 2 years. A jar of spring pesto in a canvas bag. That was all it took to remind me what it felt like to be noticed by someone who was paying attention. She never said she had feelings for me. She never touched me. She never crossed any line anyone could have pointed to and called wrong, but she did something far more dangerous than any of that. She made me feel seen. Not the version of me that wore work boots and sent invoices and ate dinner alone, the actual version. The one that cared what was underneath the layers. The one who ran the canal at 6 in the morning because the silence there felt like something real. When you've spent years being invisible, being seen by one person is more disorienting than any physical thing. It doesn't announce itself. It just settles in quietly, like water finding the gaps in old plaster, until one day you realize it's been inside the walls the whole time. Genevieve came back to Ottawa in May. She parked in front of the house on Clemo on a Thursday afternoon and stood at my door in heels that had no business on a heritage limestone front step and said she needed to talk. I let her in. She told me Toronto hadn't worked out the way she'd expected. The job was fine. The condo was fine. None of it felt like hers anymore. She wanted to try again, those exact words, try again, as if our marriage were a recipe that had just needed a different temperature. I said no clearly, without anger, without room for negotiation. Genevieve didn't accept it. She didn't leave Ottawa. She rented a furnished place in Centertown and began appearing at the coffee shop on Bank Street, where I went every morning, at the hardware store on Wellington, at the bar near Lansdowne where I watched Ottawa Senators games on winter Fridays. She wasn't trying to win me back. She was trying to make certain I couldn't forget she existed. She wanted to occupy space in my life whether I'd made room for her or not. The thing that changed everything happened on a Thursday in June. Genevieve walked into the new Edinburgh townhouse without knocking. She'd always done that, even during the marriage. As if every room she entered automatically belonged to her, and found Rowena sitting on the overturned pail near the window, reading 2 cups of black coffee on the windowsill behind her while I worked on the staircase banister 3 meters away. Nothing wrong with the scene. Nothing anyone could photograph and call evidence. But Genevieve was observant in the strategic way, not out of genuine curiosity, but out of a long habit of cataloging advantage. She noticed how I turned my whole body toward Rowena when she spoke, not just my head. She noticed how my voice dropped when I answered her. She noticed the 2 cups sitting on the sill beside each other, the way they always sat, as if they'd always belonged there together. She didn't say a word about any of it in that moment. She looked at me and smiled. I knew that smile. I'd seen it plenty of times during the marriage, usually right before something broke apart. It was the smile of a person who had just identified where the load-bearing wall was and was already deciding what to do with that information. Genevieve called Hugo. I don't know what she said precisely. I can only reconstruct from the wreckage that followed. Hugo called me the next morning. His voice had a coldness I had never heard from him in 15 years. "Is Rowena spending a lot of time at your job sites?" I told the truth, because the truth was all I had. She stopped by to check on the restoration. We talked while I worked. Nothing had ever crossed any line. Hugo went silent. A long, loaded silence that carried more than any sentence could have. Then he said 3 words. I asked what that meant. He didn't answer. He hung up. In the dead silence of that ended call, 15 years of friendship simply came apart. Hugo came back to Ottawa. He started working from home, cutting his project trips short, rearranging his schedule, not because he missed Rowena, because he was watching her. He stopped returning my messages, didn't come by, didn't answer calls. 15 years road trips to Montreal, playoff games at sports bars, 2 in the morning phone calls when things got too heavy to carry alone. And 1 call from my ex-wife dissolved all of it in an afternoon. Genevieve hadn't lied to him. That was the cruelest part. She had taken real things and arranged them until they formed a shape that looked exactly like betrayal. Hugo confronted Rowena. She called me a few days later, voice flat and controlled, the way you describe damage after a storm has passed it. He asked me if I'm in love with you. I told him no. She stopped. But I don't know anymore whether that was the truth, Max. I held the phone against my ear in my dark kitchen and said absolutely nothing for a long time. That was the first time she had used the word love, even buried in a negative, Even surrounded by uncertainty, it hit me somewhere I was not prepared for it to hit. I went to find Genevieve, not to fight. I found her at her rental on Cooper Street, sitting on the front step in a jacket that wasn't warm enough for a May evening in Ottawa, a glass of white wine in her hand. I asked her one question, why? She took a deliberate sip before answering, because you kept the house, you kept the shop, you kept your quiet little life in your quiet little city, and now there's another person sitting exactly where I used to sit. My chair at your kitchen table, my cup on your windowsill. You want me to just be fine with that? I looked at her for a long time, and I understood something I should have seen years earlier. Genevieve didn't want me back. She wanted to ensure that no one else could have what she had decided to throw away. She didn't want the life. She just didn't want someone else living it. Hugo came to the new Edinburgh townhouse on a Friday evening. He pushed the door open and stood in the entryway looking at the restored staircase. Then he looked at the windowsill. Then he looked at me. You have feelings for my wife. It wasn't a question. I didn't deny it. I said, I never touched her. Never said a word I shouldn't have said. Whether I actually see her, then yes, I do, and I can't pretend otherwise. Hugo hit me, one clean, hard punch to the jaw. I tasted blood before I felt the pain. I did not swing back. He stood there breathing for 3 seconds, then turned and walked out without another word. I sat down on the bottom step of the staircase I'd just refinished and pressed my sleeve to the corner of my mouth and understood that some fights don't have a winner. Both sides just absorb the damage and live with what's left. Rowena sent me a message that night, 2 words, I'm sorry. I stared at it for 10 minutes. I didn't reply, not because I was angry, because every word I thought of typing was a confession, and I was not ready to confess, not to her, not to Hugo, not to myself. I went dark after that. No calls, no messages, no contact with anyone. 12-hour days at the job site alone, the first Ottawa cold of November pressing against the windows. 3 weeks of nothing but the sound of my own hands on wood, and the traffic on the street below, and the occasional Canada goose making its long complaint across the gray sky. I finished the townhouse restoration in that silence. Not because I had a deadline, but because working in a place she'd visited was the only way I could be near anything that felt like her without it being her. I stripped the last section of old flooring down to the original Douglas fir, refinished every surface, replaced the rotted window casings with old growth lumber I'd been keeping in my storage unit for 2 years, waiting for exactly this kind of situation. When it was done, I stood in the front room in the late afternoon light and looked at what the house had always been underneath everything done to it. The Douglas fir glowed. The plaster was smooth. The bones of the place were exactly as honest as I'd believed they'd be the first day I walked through. And I thought about what Rowena had asked me in this exact room, months earlier. You strip everything back to find what was honest about the place. Do you ever try that with yourself? I ran my hand along the finished baseboard and understood for the first time that she hadn't been talking about the house at all. She'd been talking about the version of me I'd been keeping behind good manners and hard work and the word fine. I had spent 2 years telling everyone I was fine. I was not fine. I was hiding in plain sight, the way wallpaper hides what's underneath it, layer after layer of other people's choices covering over the original. Hugo called on a Sunday morning in early December. His voice had the quality of exhaustion that settles in after the anger burns itself out and there's nothing left but a raw, unwanted honesty you can't outrun. He said, Rowena filed for separation. I didn't speak. I stood in my kitchen with my hand flat on the counter and the phone against my ear and waited. He continued, she said it had nothing to do with you. She said it was because I never once saw her. She said 20 minutes sitting with you on a job site made her feel more present than anything we'd had in 3 years of marriage. There was a silence long enough that I could hear his kitchen through the phone. Then Hugo said the thing that cut deeper than his fist ever could have. The worst part, Max? I believe her. I believe every single word of it. I closed my eyes. Not because it felt like winning. It did not feel like winning at all. It felt like standing at the edge of something enormous, realizing you had been walking toward it your entire life without knowing it. 2 months after the separation was filed, Rowena came to the workshop behind the house on Clemo. It was February again. A different February, a year on, but Ottawa February all the same. The kind where your breath makes shapes in the air inside an unheated building. She wasn't carrying anything. No coffee, no book, no manufactured reason. She stood in the workshop doorway and said clearly and without rushing, I didn't come about anything that needs fixing. I came because I've owed you honesty for a long time. I came for you. And I'm saying that out loud now. I said, I know. She asked since when? I said since the leek pesto at the market. She laughed, a real laugh, surprised and warm and open. The first time I had ever seen her laugh without something careful behind it. I told her I needed time. Not because I didn't want this, but because of Hugo, because of 15 years, because I needed to be certain I was choosing her for who she was, and not just reaching for what was closest after everything else had fallen away. I needed to know this was a real beginning, not a reflex. She nodded without asking me to explain further. That was one of the things that made her different from everyone else I'd ever let close. She understood the shape of what I was saying before I finished saying it. She turned and walked out into the cold. I stood in the workshop and looked at the square of gray light where the door had been. I called Hugo 6 months later. We met at a pub near Lansdowne Park, a corner booth we'd sat in probably 100 times since university. 2 pints on the table. Nobody said sorry directly. That was never how we worked. Hugo looked across the table and said, "Your jaw heal up all right?" I said, "Jaw's fine. Pride's still working on it." He laughed. The sound of it loosened something in my chest that had been tight for over a year. He told me he was seeing someone in Sudbury. A woman who worked in project management, he said. Loud, full of opinions, talked through every meal, filled every silence with something. The complete opposite, he said, and was quiet for a moment then. Turns out that's what I need. Someone who talks to me. I didn't know that about myself. I nodded. I understood completely. Some people need volume. Some people need stillness. And sometimes the person you need has been standing in front of you long enough that you stopped seeing what they were actually offering. 8 months after that February morning in the workshop, I asked Rowena to dinner. A restaurant in the Byward Market. Small and warm, exposed brick, the kind of Ottawa place that has been there long enough to have regulars who remember when the neighborhood was different. Outdoor table under a heat lamp, mid-September, the light doing what September light does in Ottawa. Golden and slanted and impossibly clear, the kind of clarity that only arrives after a long summer finally lets go. She ordered coffee after dinner, black, no sugar. I smiled. She asked why. I said, "Because I knew you would." She tilted her head, the same tilt I'd seen at the job site, at the kitchen table, a specific tilt that meant she was paying careful attention, and said, "I like being clear-headed, especially around you. I don't want to miss anything." I sat across from her and realized this was the strangest first date of my life. It wasn't really a first date at all. We already knew everything, the good parts, the broken parts, the parts we were still working on, and we still wanted to sit down together. That told me more than any first impression ever could have. The following spring, Rowena rented a place on Elgin Street, 6 blocks from my house. She didn't move in with me. We saw each other almost every day, but kept our own spaces, our own rhythms, our own morning routines. That was different from Genevieve in every way that mattered. Genevieve had wanted fusion, 2 lives dissolved into one until neither person had their own shape anymore. Rowena wanted something else entirely. 2 people alongside each other, close enough to reach for, far enough apart to still be themselves. I had never understood that kind of arrangement was possible. I'd spent 4 years of marriage believing that love required you to sand down your own edges until you fit perfectly against someone else. Rowena showed me that wasn't true. The right kind of closeness leaves room for both people to keep their shape. What mattered most were never the dramatic moments. Rowena started leaving a cup of coffee on my front step every morning on her way to the gallery before I was awake. She never knocked, never waited. She just set it on the limestone step and kept going. I knew she'd been there because the cup was still warm when I unlocked the front door at 7. The city silent under whatever the Ottawa sky had decided that morning, frost, or the first wet snow of November, or the particular stillness that comes just before a big storm rolls in off the St. Lawrence. I'd stand in the open doorway and hold the cup in both hands for a moment before going inside, and the day started differently. Not better in any way I could put into words. Just different, like someone had quietly opened a window before you arrived, and you feel the change in the air before you understand what caused it. I never mentioned it to her. She never mentioned it to me. It was ours without either of us having to claim it. The ring the cup left on the limestone step, a dark circle, slowly absorbed into the stone. I never cleaned it off. By midwinter there were a dozen of them, overlapping, darkening that one section of the step like a record of mornings kept. Any other contractor would have cleaned that with a pressure washer or sealed it with a stone treatment. I didn't touch it. Some marks are not damage. Some marks are proof that someone came back, morning after morning, without being asked. One evening, Rowena sat across from me at my kitchen table, holding her coffee in both hands, and said, "Do you remember the night you fixed the pipe in Hugo's bathroom?" I said yes. She said, "Do you know what I was thinking the whole time you were under the floor?" I said no. She said, "I was thinking, I'm watching the only person I know who just does the hard thing. He doesn't talk about it. He just gets under the floor and fixes it." She set the cup down on the table between us. I wasn't thinking about the pipe. I set my hand flat on the table. She looked at it. The distance between my fingers and the base of her cup, one hand span. The same distance as those two cups on the kitchen table the February night of the burst pipe 2 years before. This time I did not measure it with my eyes and look away. This time I did not look down first. Love is not always a thing that announces itself. Sometimes it is the sound of a coffee cup being set on a limestone step every morning, patient and steady, asking for nothing, expecting nothing, until the day you realize you've been listening for it before you even open your eyes. I lost my best friend for a while. I got punched in the jaw by someone I'd have taken a hit for without thinking. My ex-wife tried to burn something down out of nothing but spite and nearly succeeded. I spent months carrying feelings I had convinced myself I had no right to feel. But I learned something through all of it that changed how I see everything since. You don't get to choose what you feel. You only get to choose what you do with it. I never betrayed Hugo. Rowena never betrayed Hugo. That marriage ended because it needed to, because two people who needed fundamentally different things had finally run out of road, and Rowena was honest enough to say so before anyone else was ready to hear it. A glass of water, a cup of black coffee, the most ordinary things in the world. But in a life where everyone is constantly adding something, more noise, more performance, more reassurance, the person holding the simple thing, the clear thing, the thing that asks nothing of you except your presence, that's the person who can actually see you. Sometimes the one who changes your life doesn't arrive with a grand gesture or a prepared declaration. They just show up, morning after morning, and leave something warm on your doorstep and trust you to understand it when you're ready. So let me ask you this. Have you ever been so used to being invisible that when someone finally looked at you clearly, you didn't know what to do with it? And if you discovered feelings you were certain you had no right to have, would you bury them forever? Or would you wait for the moment when being honest stopped costing someone else more than it cost you? If this story made you stop and think, leave a like below. If you want to hear more stories like this one, subscribe and hit the bell. And if you have an answer to either of those questions, drop it in the comments. I read every single one. See you in the next one.